Hello everyone, Fred here. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing Season 3, Episode 2 of My Adventures with Superman, Mobile Suit Toyman. So here goes. Clark, Lois, Jimmy, and Kara attend Superfest in this episode. It's sort of a Metropolis Comic Con event based primarily around honoring Superman and Supergirl, where Jimmy reveals that he's now publishing his own comic book series, Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen, and this is actually a pretty clever call out to the actual comic book series of the same name that was published by DC Comics from 1954 to 1974 and that ran for 163 issues. Anyway, Bizarro is actually at the convention and has the time of his life checking out the displays and hanging out with Superman fans who like his costume. Meanwhile, Lois spots Winslow shot at the convention. She becomes convinced that he's once again up to something nefarious, and she decides to follow him and investigate to see what he's planning so that she can write an article about it. Kara repeatedly and embarrassingly makes clear to Jimmy that she is wildly attracted to him on a romantic level and wants to have with him what Clark has with Lois, but Jimmy directly tells her, despite prodding by Lois to pull the trigger on starting a relationship with her, that he does not want to start anything romantic with her, or at least not yet. In his estimation, she's still new to Earth and figuring herself out. Despite being clearly attracted to her, Jimmy does not want to take advantage of her while she's still learning, and he also, still having a rather massive inferiority complex, doesn't want to take her away from someone else who might be worthier of her. Regardless, this leaves Kara heartbroken. Meanwhile, Superman is called to stop a bank robbery by a Russian thief who calls herself the Whip and who fights with metallic whips that make use of kryptonite-powered technology that was apparently scavenged from the Metallo robots and the Brainiac invasion from the end of Season 2. Back at the Superfest, Kara as Supergirl is interviewed by Cat Grant and starts to feel anxious about herself because of Cat's repeatedly invasive and aggressive questions. A young girl named Jessica Cruz is there to watch the interview and encourages Kara by reminding her how brave she is and saying that she wants to be as brave as Kara. Jessica also actually goes on to praise Kara as being distinct from Superman in that while Superman defends Metropolis and Earth, Kara proactively fights for Metropolis and Earth. Kara, also feeling rejected by Jimmy, effectively opens up a booth at the convention for interested suitors to attempt winning her heart so that she can select a proper life partner. Jimmy naturally watches as a virtual sea of more successful and more muscular men than he is approach her, and despite being happy for her, he still naturally feels a little weird about how fast she's moving on from him. Lex Luthor shows up at the convention, criticizes Jimmy's comics, and tells Jimmy that he's organizing a special presentation for later during the convention. Elsewhere, Lois, obsessed with proving that Winslow shot, who passes himself off as a harmless dealer of toys for kids, is actually plotting something evil, keeps pressuring him until he ultimately snaps and activates a giant Gundam-like robot whose parts he's hidden around his booth at the convention and which he uses to cause havoc at the convention. And that twist really is foreshadowed both in this show's Season 3 trailer and in this episode's very title, which is a clever little play on the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise. Anyway, Superman, having just finished beating the Whip by letting her win against him until her technology runs out of its kryptonite-fueled power and subsequently restraining her, returns to the convention and prepares to stop Winslow and his robot. However, before he can, Hank Henshaw arrives as a cybernetically rebuilt hero modeled on Superman and brutally stops Winslow by destroying his robot. Lex Luthor immediately swoops in afterwards to declare Hank a real American hero in whom people can put their faith instead of aliens like Superman and Supergirl, and crowds of people who saw Hank defeat Winslow eat it up. Lois is visibly hurt by Hank's working with Lex, specifically against Superman, and asks what he thinks he's doing, only for Hank to say that he's helping to secure humanity's future. Later, as Lois, Jimmy, Clark, and Kara are going home, Kara questions Clark about why Lex and the other people on Earth don't trust her and asks if she did something wrong. Clark tells her that the people of Earth didn't trust him long before Kara came along, and that the only thing that he or she can do is continue to prove their prejudice wrong by continuing to be good even when others expect nothing but bad from them. Elsewhere, Lex and Slade Wilson perform some mechanical maintenance on Hank. Lex tells Hank that the convention went even better than expected. He was planning to just use the convention to unveil Hank as the face of American heroism, but got the perfect opportunity to show off Hank in action when Winslow attacked. He says that they're one step closer to winning the hearts and minds of Metropolis, to which Hank responds that they're one step closer to saving the world from Superman. And that's where the episode ends. Alright, here are my thoughts. And just like in my episode 1 review, I will start with the things that I did not like. First, the power scaling. It makes no sense in a show where Superman and Supergirl have been displayed with the ability to hear literally every sound within at least the city of Metropolis, that Jimmy and Lois are not more concerned about Kara's hearing their secret conversations, about Jimmy's pursuing Kara romantically when she's fewer than 100 feet away from them. It makes no sense that Kara does not in fact hear them. On a larger scale, the fight between Superman and the Whip was another nonsensical disappointment that only makes sense if you watch it assuming from the start that Superman intentionally decides at the front to avoid hurting the Whip by just throwing the fight against her until her technology stops working so that he can bring her in peaceably. And on the one hand, that would be in keeping with Superman's character, but on the other hand, it still feels like some weak sauce for Superman to have a harder time subduing some D-list fashionista with glorified whips than he has subduing Black Ops mercenaries and supervillains who made far more lethal uses of kryptonite and his other weaknesses in previous episodes. And this really is the primary problem with writing Superman for television, especially on a long-form basis. It becomes increasingly hard to throw threats his way that he should not be able to overcome in 3 seconds. The writers of this show smartly avoided that problem for the first 2 seasons by depicting him as a bit of a pacifistic, nerdy kid who's still discovering his full abilities. But by this point in the show, he has learned and grown enough that that excuse really is starting to wear a little thin from a believability standpoint. Yeah, I do think that narratively Superman as presented in this show should still be a far cry from peak Superman, but he should also be much better than this. Second, and really this ties into the Whip plotline, I do not like the direction that the Whip seem to be implying that this show might be going, where everyone can now get access to kryptonite because the Metallo robots and Brainiac left it all over Metropolis at the end of season 2. It does make sense from a narrative standpoint, but I still don't like it. I've never been a fan of Superman stories or runs where basically everyone and their dogs have access to kryptonite that they can conveniently spam to either defeat Superman or prolong battles with him for far longer than they should realistically last. That old Superman prequel show Smallville was a bit like that. And I loved that show, but I hated how you could predict major parts of the plot of most episodes just because of how they overused the kryptonite out to explain why Clark could not just stop 90% of problems that he should have been able to stop in 5 seconds. Yeah, kryptonite works best when it's a very rare resource that everyone cannot get and that only a few major villains have or use. That's what makes it an effective and respectable plot device versus a cheap gimmick that writers deploy because they've got no better ideas how to make Superman villains or stories compelling. Third, I was not a big fan of the Toyman plot this episode. It really just felt very random and tacked on and phoned in, how Toyman just happens to show up at the convention to sell toys to small children, but has secretly got the parts for a giant Gundam suit hidden at his booth so that he can, just whip it out whenever he feels like terrorizing somebody who bothers him. It makes no sense. I actually thought that the end of this episode was going to reveal that Lex Luthor somehow paid him to do all that in order to give Hank Henshaw a massive debut. that still would not have made very much narrative sense, but it would have been viable. And that is a problem that I've really started to notice this season between the first episode and now this one. The sort of disappointing shift from the much more character-driven and serialized tones of seasons 1 and 2, where even most seemingly filler episodes and moments tied beautifully into the overall whole, into a much more plot-driven narrative this season, where stuff just happens to Clark and Jimmy and Lois and Kara because it needs to. Like how last episode, Sam Lane basically just popped up out of nowhere, suddenly working for the Pentagon to drop the story's main plotline in Lois's lap for no narratively sensible reason. I still don't think it's a major problem yet because it's only happened in 2 episodes of this season's 10 as of now, but it's still starting to become noticeable. Fourth, I did not much care for the ongoing romantic drama between Jimmy and Kara. On the one hand, I think Jimmy definitely makes a very good point and demonstrates quite a bit of maturity in turning Kara down, specifically because he does not want to take advantage of her before she's had a bit more experience on Earth and figured out exactly what and who she wants for real. Because at the close of the day, Kara, in her overexcitement, sees herself and Jimmy as having what Clark and Lois do, but she keeps overlooking the fact that things are very different between her and Jimmy because she does not have nearly the maturity or experience that Clark did when he pursued Lois. She was basically raised as a brainwashed weapon more than a human being for most of her life, and she does need to take quite a bit more time to develop as an actual person before she's even close to ready for the type of commitment that she thinks she wants with Jimmy right now. But on the other hand, Jimmy's aversion to getting with Kara now, especially because he questions if she's worthy of her, feels like such an annoying retcon of how close they were getting and how into her he was at the end of season 2. Yeah, this new Jimmy-Kara plotline feels almost like a lesser redo of the overly melodramatic Superman-Lois plotline from season 2, and because this show is not very subtle at all, I could see most of the developments coming from a mile away. How Kara is so over the moon for Jimmy, how she inevitably gets hurt and misinterprets him when he suggests that they pump the brakes so that she can take a little time to figure herself out, how he inevitably gets hurt by how fast she takes his advice and starts basically interviewing potential perfect boyfriends. Now again, this is not and has never been a subtle show. It's fairly safe to say that Kara and Jimmy will end up together by the end of the season, or that they'll both at least end up happy with whatever dynamic they do have by then. But still, especially given how this show did essentially this same type of thing last season with Superman and Lois, right down to Lois is pushing Superman to go on a dating show to impress potential partners and later getting angry about it, and given how poorly it was done the first time, I don't really have much desire to watch it all go down again with different characters. Fifth and finally, I did not like Lois in this episode. Lois Lane has already been one of my least favorite characters in this show. She is nothing like the actual Lois Lane of the comics. Self-secure, brilliant, righteously inquisitive, internally strong enough to both capture Superman's heart and maintain a relationship with Earth's greatest hero. Lois Lane in this show is more like a hyperactive, manipulative, vain, petty, selfish, emotionally unstable rip-off of Lois Lane. She's always taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and it really is a testament to Clark and Jimmy's decency that they have not, by now, cut her out of their lives permanently because of her general toxicity and just how casual she is with it. Like, there was a plotline this episode that had her surprised by a comic book at the convention that portrayed her as a knife-wielding demon, unable to fathom that anyone would see her that way. And when I saw it, I was just thinking, yes, this is exactly how most sane people would see you in this show. Anyway, her biggest problem in this episode was her whole plotline with Toyman and the way that she set her sights on him and started antagonizing him just for showing up at a convention and trying to sell toys to kids and families. And yes, I grant that anybody could understand that Lois would still be angry with Toyman after the way that he betrayed her and her father to the government last season. and that anybody could understand that Lois would want to know why, after that betrayal, Toyman just showed up again someplace where she was, refusing to even apologize to her or take responsibility for what he did. And yes, you could say that Lois's suspicions were ultimately justified in that it did turn out that Toyman had sneaked a giant Gundam suit into the convention for whatever reason, but she had no concept of that when she just decided to unapologetically go after Toyman on sight and start ripping apart his display with zero proof that he was up to anything nefarious at the time. It was just so over the top and so insensitive and so on point for this show's Lois in the worst possible way. Anyway, all that said, let me get into the things that I liked about this episode. The little teases of the wider DC Comics universe and fun jabs at particularly Superman mythology again did not disappoint. I'm thinking about that little debacle about how Supergirl wants to be called Power Woman instead, referencing the 2015 Supergirl show, and of course the character of Power Woman from the comics. I'm thinking about how Jimmy and the other members of Superman's friend group finally get the iconic Superman summoning watches of the sort that Superman famously gave Jimmy in the comics. I'm thinking about the Teen Titans teases of Raven, Beast Boy, and Starfire, though I do think it may be a bit of a misstep to tease those particular characters at this specific time. I do think those characters are generally presented as being teenagers, while Superman and heroes of his generation are in their 30s, and Superman is just in his early 20s in this series, so it does feel a little like jumping the gun to me. I don't really think that the Titans should exist until probably much later in this show's run from a chronological standpoint. I continue to enjoy the slow build-up of Bizarro as he continues to be so sweet and to interact with the world, learning and seeing more and more. It just raises the tension in the best ways, because we all know that given his comic book history, he is probably going to go evil or insane or both before this season is up, possibly after he feels betrayed or hurt by someone he trusts or likes. That type of twist would be par for this show's course. I have enjoyed since this show's beginning and continued in this episode to enjoy the slow build-up of Hank Henshaw's turn to villainy. I really have liked how over 3 seasons this show has methodically taken him from being a brave pilot and government agent who was friendly with Lois Lane to being an anti-alien racist who hates Superman possibly more than Lex Luthor does and who feels that he needs to save Earth from him. Still, I do wonder why and how Hank came to be so brainwashed in his own racism that he actually thinks Superman is a bigger threat than the corruption in his own government when he's seen Superman make only a few small mistakes that might damage absolute trust, but knows that his own government was kidnapping American citizens to be used in illegal human experimentation and turned into living weapons. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense how in his twisted worldview, Superman is an absolute threat because of a few small mistakes when Amanda Waller is not, despite that she masterminded a campaign to abduct, experiment upon, and unalive literal American citizens in the country that Hank purports to serve. I very much enjoyed the way that this episode continued this season's arc of advancing Supergirl's identity crisis to strongly build her into a character who is of similar morality to Superman, but who is different and distinguishable from Superman. Going that direction is the only way that Supergirl is going to continue working as a main character in this show, and the writers fortunately seem to be very aware of that. I particularly enjoyed that line by Jessica Cruz about how, in her opinion, Superman defends the people of Metropolis while Supergirl fights for them. Really, I think that having Supergirl grow into that role more over the season would be a perfect capstone to and full circle development of her entire warrior heritage storyline. Just this show, as of now, to me, is presenting perhaps the best take on the Supergirl character from a developmental standpoint that I've seen. Honestly, I feel like the writers of the Supergirl movie should have been taking notes from the writers of this series. This show's approach of Superman defends the people while Kara fights for them is infinitely better, after all, than the Supergirl movie's garbage take of Superman sees the good in people and Supergirl sees the truth. But I'll get into that further when I do review the Supergirl movie, probably early next week. Anyway, final thing I enjoyed about this episode, I like the organic and touching way that this show introduced Jessica Cruz as a character, making her a Supergirl fan who's actually inspired by Supergirl to want to be a superhero. And that's a plot thread that will of course be paid off in the upcoming My Adventures with Green Lantern. And the whole time I was watching, I was just thinking, yes, this here is exactly how good writers set up a spin-off show. Coming off of reviewing The Boys a few weeks ago and seeing how that show went about ruining itself in the final season to set up the spin-off show Vought Rising, it was refreshing to watch a show finally do the job properly. Jessica Cruz is set up as a character who will be affected by, but will not affect the main My Adventures with Superman narrative in terms of drawing attention away from it. And as a bonus, her introduction sort of advances that narrative by making Supergirl a stronger character in depicting her slowly cultivating a fan base in her own right, like Superman has. Now, overall, I still think that doing a Green Lantern story with Jessica Cruz instead of Hal Jordan to start is a mistake, but that's a story for another day and does not take away from the brilliant way that Jessica Cruz was introduced in this episode. All told, this episode was not as good as the season's first, but was still decent-ish with several things to like about it, so I give it 3 Cronuts out of 5. At any rate, though, that's just my opinion. Be sure to sound off in the comments and let me know yours. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Are your feelings more complex? And when you're done with that, don't forget to like and follow for more.